Hi everyone, my name is Shalhevet Schwartz, and this is Gefet on Daf Yomi, a joint project of Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha. We have begun Bava Batra. So now we are in the first parak of Bava Batra, in the parak that deals with begins with Dinei Shchegim, right, the laws of neighbors, and expands from that to deal really with the laws of local community governance, and right of not only of neighbors but of the neighborhood. And we are in a brief kind of 3-daf interlude that deals with Dinei Tzedaka, the laws of charity and tzedakah. The question that we'll be addressing together today is a question of coercion in tzedakah, really the question of whether or not, and if so, how beit can coercively enforce the rules of tzedakah. It can take money from the rich in order to give it to the poor. That's really the question. We'll be addressing a Tosafot that asks this question and several answers that it offers, and see what we can glean from those different answers. But first, beginning on our daf chet, we're going to start with a breita that takes us really into those questions. So, Tanu Rabbanit, קופה של הצדקה נגבית בשניים ומתחלקת בשלושה, נגבית בשניים שאין עושים צרות על הציבור פחות בשניים, ומתחלקת בשלושה כדיני ממונות. So the breita begins by bringing us the first kind of example of the charity pot, which is the kupat tzedakah. There are different kinds of pools of money that are meant to be distributed to the poor. So one is called the kupat tzedakah, that is collected, right? The breita says here that it's collected in you need 2 people to collect it, and you need 2 people, and is distributed in by a group of 3. So it's collected by a group of 2 because coercion or coercive enforcement, coercive enforcement on a community has to be done by a group of 2, and it is distributed in a group of 3 because it's distributing finances, distributing money on a communal level is considered to be a form of deen, and deen, right, like deen, all dinei mamonot happens in 3. So right, we're considering the distributors of tzedakah to be sort of judges, and that requires a beit of 3. Right, so that's the kupat tzedakah. Now we're talking about a different pot of money, the tamchui. So the tamchui nigbe b'shlosha mitchalek b'shlosha shegivuya v'chalukah shavim. Right, the tamchui is both collected and distributed in a group of 3 because those are happening together. Right, and we'll see in a moment. Right, the breita gives us other distinctions between the tamchui and the kupa. The tamchui b'chol yom, right, the tamchui is collected every day, so it's collected and distributed every day. The kupa me'erev Shabbat l'erev Shabbat, right? The kupa is distributed once a week. Tamchui la'aniyei olam, kupa la'aniyei ha'ir. The tamchui is distributed to all poor, not just the local poor, and the kupa is distributed to the aniyei ha'ir. Now the breita ends with a piece that we're actually gonna come back to a little bit later, but Risha'im b'nei ha'ir asot kupa tamchui v'tamchui kupa v'lishnota l'chol ma she'yirtzu. Right, the b'nei ha'ir, right, the citizens are able to essentially reassign the funds from the kupa to the tamchui, or from the tamchui to the kupa, and to reassign it for whatever they want. We're not really sure yet what whatever they want means. We'll see more later. And the breita continues, Risha'im b'nei ha'ir lahatnot al hamidot v'al ha'sha'arim, right, the officers of the citizenry of the city can also make legislation around weights and measures and around cost, right? You can set price caps, al schar po'alim, set a minimum wage, l'hasiyah, etc. So that's the breita that we are beginning with. The Gemara on that breita, right, asks, right, you need 2 people to collect the kupa because because it's essentially deemed a coercive activity, and in order to enforce or coerce matters like this, you need at least 2 people. So the Gemara asks on this, my siraruta, right? What's the coercion involved? We're talking about tzedakah, right? Someone walking around with the gabbai walking around in shul with a tzedakah box isn't coercing anyone. So what the Gemara answers to Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Bar Avua lefi shemimashkenina hatzedakah ve'afilu be'erev Shabbat. So actually, we do coercively enforce tzedakah, right? We mimashkenina al hatzedakah, meaning I am if I'm coming to collect tzedakah and you refuse to give it to me, I can come and confiscate your property. And even on Erev Shabbat, right? Even I can come into your house on Erev Shabbat and take your stuff in order to enforce your giving of tzedakah. Gemara asks, "Ini v'hakti ufakarti al kolo chatzav." Right, the Gemara quotes a pasuk, ufakarti. I will essentially punish all of their oppressors, referring to the oppressors of Israel. V'amar Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta mishmei derav v'afilu al gabay tzedakah. So who are these oppressors of Israel? Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta says in the name of Rav that refers that the set of people to whom that refers includes even the gabay tzedakah. Right, that it's a bad thing to oppress, that those who coercively collect tzedakah are considered oppressors of Israel. The Gemara responds, "Lo kasha hada amid hada lo amid." Depends on whether we're collecting tzedakah from rich people or from not so rich people. It's not such a big deal you're not an oppressor of Israel if you coercively enforce the collection of tzedakah from the rich. Kiha de Rabba Achve Rav Nathan Bar Ami V'Shakim Minei Arba Me'azuzei Tzedakah. Right, and the Gemara then brings us an example of Rava who forcibly collected from Rav Nathan Bar Ami. Presumably Rav Nathan Bar Ami was rich. An amount tzedakah amounting to 400 zuz, which is no small sum. It's as we know from Ketubah is Mea or Matayim. So this is, a significant, sizable chunk of money that Rava was coercively collecting from Rav Nathan Bar Ami. So what we see here is a picture of tzedakah of the collection of tzedakah that is essentially coercive. And the Gemara wonders about that, but doesn't seem to essentially have a problem with that, nor does it challenge the assumption that that's the way that tzedakah and the collection of tzedakah works. Tosafot, though, is going to struggle to understand this because, according to Tosafot, at least the assumption, according to the assumption behind the challenge that Tosafot is going to bring, tzedakah should be the kind of thing that beit is not allowed to enforce via coercion. So, right, how does Tosafot frame the question? Right, Amar kol mitzvot aseh matan tzchara k'tuva b'tzidah in beit din shamatam uzharin alaha. Legabei tzedakah k'tiv kipat. So we know from the Gemara in Chulin that here's the principle. The principle is kol mitzvot aseh matan tzchara b'tzidah. Right, any mitzvot aseh whose reward is alongside it, or whose reward is written alongside it. We'll understand what that means. Ein beit din shamatam uzharin alaha. The beit din shamata, right? The beit din of human beings is not supposed to be right. Is not muzhar aleha, right? Is not commanded to enforce it or ought not to enforce it. So what does it mean? Mitzvah shematan tzchar b'tzidah. There are certain mitzvot in the Torah that, right, for example, Kibud Avim, I believe, is a paradigmatic example of this, where it says L'ma'an yitavlach, L'ma'an yarichun yamecha. Right, that the reward for it is framed as Ketuvah b'tzidah is written right alongside it in the psukim in the Torah. When it commands you to do the thing, it also says, and here is going to be your reward. And right, essentially these tend to be the kinds of mitzvot that really are in some sense also are their own reward, right? That the reward that comes with it is sort of an obvious corollary or an obvious consequence of the mitzvah itself. So those mitzvot, according to us, what it seems like we are not supposed to coerce. The Gefet Tzedakah, k'tiv kipatoch kiftach yadchalo, right? Tzedakah, we're commanded to say, right, to open our hands. Uktiv ki biglal hadavar hazeh yivarechecha, and right, because of it, right, in virtue of you doing this thing, right, God will bless you. Right, matan tzchara k'tuva b'tzidah, right, we have the reward written right alongside it. So Tosafot's challenge is made up of essentially two components, right? There are two working axioms that Tosafot is making here. One is that kol mitzvah shematan tzchara b'tzidah, beit din is not allowed to enforce via coercion. And number two is that tzedakah is in fact an example of one such mitzvah, right? Given that, how could it be that Rava was coercing Rav Nathan Bar Ami to give tzedakah, right? It's forbidden to enforce, for beitin to enforce such a rule. So Tosafot is going to offer, or we're going to see 4 different answers that Tosafot is going to bring. We're going to try to understand both kind of on a content level, sort of basically what those solutions are, but also methodologically, right, how Tosafot is working. And then we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into a couple of those answers and see what we can glean from them about kind of broader questions about the mitzvah of tzedakah. So answer number 1 of Tosafot. Solution number 1, V'omer Rabbeinu Tam tehai kafiyah bidvarim. Kimo kafiyah ve'al, prepared na'araf nipashta. So, right, solution number 1, Tosafot is going to maintain the 2 assumptions, right? It is both the case that all mitzvot shematan schar b'tzidah, mitzvot aseh shematan schar b'tzidah, we do not coerce, and number 2, that tzedakah is in fact an example of this. But what's Tosafot doing here, right? Rabbeinu Tam's first answer is it's a sort of ukimta on the Gemara, right? It's not that really Rava was coercively enforcing this rule. He wasn't. He was kafi bidvarim. He was only verbally persuading Rav Natan to give tzedakah. He wasn't in fact coercing it. So right, solution 1, Tosafot can maintain the 2 assumptions, but say that the particular case here was not in fact a case of coercive enforcement of dinei tzedakah. That's solution number 1. It wasn't real coercion, it was verbal persuasion. It's a bit of an okimta because it really makes it sound like he forced him in the Gemara that we saw. Solution number 2. Okay, solution number 2. Right. The additional answer is that the Bnei Ha'ir, right, the citizens of the location in question, took upon themselves that they would be that the Gabbai Tzedakah, the collector of Tzedakah, would be able to coerce them. So it's a sort of voluntary coercion, as it were. The people take on the commitment to give Tzedakah even via coercion. So with this solution also, Rabbeinu Tam manages to maintain the 2 assumptions, right? The 2 working assumptions: one, that mitzvot aseh shematan schar b'tzidah, you cannot enforce coercively. Number 2, that tzedakah is in fact an example of one such mitzvah. But it's not that this particular case wasn't coercion, but it's that the tzedakah, we've sort of found a workaround. The tzedakah referred to in this story is not the tzedakah of the mitzvah that we normally think about, but is in fact a sort of separate category of charity that the people of the town had taken upon themselves voluntarily, and therefore they had also taken upon themselves voluntarily that they are willing to be coerced in order to pay their taxes, as it were. We've sort of found a workaround that allows for enforcement in this particular case. Solution number 2. That onto solution number 3. So solution number 3, this is the solution of the Ri. The beit tzedakah kofin mishum de'it ba lav dichtiv ba lo te'ametz et levavcha v'lo tikvot. So solution number 3, according to the Ri, sure, in general, with mitzvot aseh shematan schar b'tzidah, we do not coercively enforce them, but he's rejecting the second assumption, which is that tzedakah is in fact an example of one such mitzvah. Why is tzedakah different according to the Ri? Tzedakah is different according to the Ri because it is not only a mitzvah aseh, but also includes a lav. Right? There's a mitzvah aseh, patuach tiftach et yadcha. Sure, if it were just that, we wouldn't be able to enforce it. But in addition, there is a lo ta'aseh, lo ta'ametz et levavcha, and if there's a lo ta'aseh, then beit din is allowed to enforce it. Right? So first working assumption that mitzvot aseh shematan schar b'tzidah in kofin alehen means we don't enforce that. Beit din doesn't enforce it. Sure, we can keep that one because we are saying that tzedakah is not a good example of one such mitzvah. It includes a lo ta'aseh, and therefore that principle does not apply to this particular halacha. That's solution number 3. And solution number 4, which is the Ritzvah solution. For the Ritzvah nira dehad ein beit din musarin al mitzvot aseh shematan schar b'tzidah. Now, what the Ritzvah is going to do is he's not going to reject our second assumption, but he's going to reject our first assumption. Right? What did we say before? We said Tosafot's question was based on the idea that, right, kol mitzvah aseh shematan schar b'tzidah, beit din is not allowed to enforce it. Right? What the Ritzvah is saying is, no, you didn't understand what it meant in the Gemara in Chulin. When in the Gemara in Chulin it said Kol mitzvot aseh shematan schar b'tzidah ein beit din shel mata muzharin alehem. That beit din shel mata is not commanded or warned about it. That doesn't mean what you thought it meant. It doesn't mean that they're not allowed to enforce it via coercion. Instead, it means de'ein enashim, that they are not punished for their failure to enforce it. Right? Their beit din is allowed to enforce whatever they want, including mitzvot aseh shematan schar b'tzidah. But with other mitzvot, beit din really, really has to enforce it. And if they don't enforce it, then it's on them. With a mitzvah who's matan schar b'tzidah, even if beit din doesn't enforce it, right? That's okay. V'chein mashma, the Tosafot is going to continue. V'chein mashma b'Yerushalmi, demo cheret asvina. Right? There's a sugya in the Yerushalmi in the parakom cheret asvina. V'hai dechol basar. Right? Delo have a mokir avua v'kaftuhu v'amar lehu shavku. So referring to a case where someone is not properly being mechabed his father, right? And kibud avayim is the paradigmatic example of a mitzvah who's matan schar b'tzidah, and beit din was enforcing it, and the amar lehu shavku, and they said to him, leave him. So we understood leave him as, oh no, beit din's not allowed to enforce that. But achi pirushu einchem muzharin lahachricho ad she'aseh kishar mitzvot aseh. Right? What the Ritzvah is saying that means is not that you have to leave him, but that you can leave him. Right? You don't have to enforce it the way that you have to enforce other mitzvot aseh. Right? If beit din tells someone to make a sukkah or a lulav, and they're enforcing it, they can coerce, use corporal punishment. But with the kind of mitzvah who's matan schar b'tzidah, about that we let beit din off the hook if beit din doesn't want to enforce it. So just to review, right, what the Ritzvah has done here, but sure, tzedakah is a perfectly fine example of a mitzvah to say matan schar b'tzidah, but we don't have a problem with beit din's enforcement of it, because actually what beit din is not forbidden to enforce such mitzvot aseh, but only does not have to and is not punished for its failure to do so. So to kind of take a step back and look at these four different solutions that Tosafot offers, right, and both technically, right, what does Tosafot respond in each of these cases, right, what are each of these answers that it's offering, and as well as that sort of methodologically, how does it work? So solution one, Rabbanit Tam saying, actually, this isn't coercion. What happened in this story was only verbal persuasion, so that we're accepting both of the working assumptions behind the challenge, right? That we're not allowed to enforce such mitzvot, and that tzedakah is a good example of those mitzvot. But we are also sort of rejecting the idea that the case at hand is connected to the larger question of coercion, right? The case that we're talking about just isn't a case of enforcing or via coercion tzedakah. That's solution one. Solution number two, right, we're adding to the story, actually, there was a voluntary acceptance of future coercion by the community, right, assuming that it's possible to make such an arrangement. So here too, Rabbanit Tam we can accept both of the assumptions behind the challenge, but the case at hand, we're not talking about tzedakah here, right? We're talking about tzedakah, but we're not talking about the kind of tzedakah about which coercion is not allowed. We're talking about a different framework for tzedakah, and in this framework, the kiblu alai framework, coercion is allowed. Solution number three, right, explains that tzedakah, because tzedakah includes a negative commandment, the principle from Chulin doesn't apply to it. It's not considered a mitzvah for these purposes. So we solve our problem by rejecting the second assumption behind the challenge. And solution number four, right, explains that sure, the principle from Chulin is relevant to the b'nai tzedakah, but it doesn't forbid coercion. It just posits that beit din is not punished for failing to coerce. And what solution four is doing, solution of the Ritzvah, is not rejecting the second assumption, but is rejecting the first assumption. So that, broadly speaking, is Tosafot's four different answers to his challenge. And what we're going to do now, I think, is take a bit of a deeper dive into solution two and then into solution three that show up in Tosafot, and see what we can glean from them. So just to review solution two, the second solution of Rabbanit Tam is the kiblu alaihu solution, right? The the idea that actually the tzedakah that we're talking about in the story of Rava and Rav Natan or Rabbi Natan is not simply the tzedakah that we are commanded about in the Torah, but there's this kind of additional layer of communal acceptance, and communal acceptance even of the possibility of coercion. And I think this answer can take us into a kind of larger picture or a larger position that we see in Tosafot throughout the few dapim that we're working with here on Dinei Tzedaka, and it can give us a little bit of a sense of what according to Tosafot Dinei Tzedaka are doing in our parak and how they operate. In order to sort of we're going to take a window into this through another route, through a different position of Ba'alei Tosafot on our daf, actually, that relates to one of the other questions that came up in our Breta that we're going to see is going to be actually connected to the position of Rabbeinu Tam here. That too is going to be the position of Rabbeinu Tam. So let's just sort of jump to that other question. On our daf, on daf chet, we saw in our Breta that what did we say about the Bnei Ha'ir? We said Risha'in Bnei Ha'ir la'asod kupa tamchoi v'tamchoi kupa. Right, the Bnei Ha'ir are able to, or are permitted to, reassign the charity funds from one kupat tzedakah to the other kupat tzedakah, and v'lishnota l'chol ma she'yirtzu, right, to reassign it for any purposes they want. So now there's a question of what does that mean? Any purposes they want. And there's actually a machloket between Tosafot and the Ri Migash as to whether or not any purposes they want must mean tzorchei ha'aniyim, right? Whether the charity money must be given to the poor or not. So the Ri Migash, right, and very reasonably thinks that kol ma she'yirtzu only includes reassigning money to the poor in other ways. So what does the Ri Migash say? V'dafka mikupa l'tamchoi mitapchoi kupa, right? Shakol tzorech aniyim, right? Only from one kupat tzedakah to the other, because all of it is for the needs of the aniyim. Aval im ratzu lishnotam lidvarim acherim she'inam mitzorchei ha'aniyim asur degezel aniyim. But if you want to reassign it to other purposes, other public work projects, who knows what, you can't, because that's considered gezel aniyim. You're stealing from the aniyim. The money that was in the kupat tzedakah was meant for the aniyim, is miyuad to them, and anything to offer them anything less is to steal from them. Tosafot, on the other hand, disagrees. The position of Rabbeinu Tam, near Yael, Rabbeinu Tam, right? We can reassign it even to a davar harashut, even to something that, right, not obviously tzedakah. Right, Rabbeinu Tam was noheg to give money from the kupat tzedakah to the guards of the city, right? That because al dat bnei ha'ir nofnim otam, because it was because the money was given al dat bnei ha'ir, meaning with the knowledge and with sort of the assumption of the citizenry of the city, that it could plausibly be reassigned, and that it could be reassigned even for other kinds of public works projects. So when we take a step back and think about, right, what we see in Tosafot as as an understanding of what tzedakah is here, right? Tzedakah can be reassigned not only to the poor, but to other public works projects. We see that, right, when we think about tzedakah in the Torah, patoch tiftach et yadcha la'ani, right, there's a kind of a commandment incumbent upon the individual to give charity to other individuals. There's a sort of a sense in which that's a kind of cultivation of virtue, cultivation of good neighborliness, whatever it is you want to call it. But it seems to be a mitzvah that's incumbent on the individual. On the other hand, the picture that we see here in Tosafot is a picture of tzedakah that's actually a public project that is part of a broader communal, a broader sense of communal responsibility to contribute to the public welfare. It looks less like an individual charity than it looks honestly like a tax. And with that knowledge, right, we can kind of go back to the position, that position of Rabbeinu Tam, the second solution to the question of coercion, and we can understand why it is that that kiblu alayhu, that communities have take upon themselves that they're willing to be coerced, because ultimately what we're talking about isn't the private mitzvah of tzedakah, shematan schara b'tzida, but what we're talking about is commitment to a larger project of communal welfare, and that requires buy-in on everybody's part, and it often requires enforcement, and some of that enforcement must be coercive. But that the picture of tzedakah that we see in Bava Batra isn't the picture of the individual of the mitzvah incumbent on the individual, but is a picture of a larger communal project. And maybe that even explains what dinei tzedakah are doing here in Bava Batra, right? Bava Batra, as we've discussed in the first paragraph of Bava Batra deals with dinei shchenim, right, and communal law in general, right? What it means to build a society that is functional and just. And tzedakah, as it's actually practiced on a communal level, right, isn't only about virtue, but it is about exactly that. It's about building a society that is both functional and just. So, right, Tosafot here, Tosafot on Lishnotah L'chol Mashir 2 on the reassignment of communal funds, Rabbeinu Tam's position that actually any public works project is a legitimate use of those public funds, even the ones that were intended for tzedakah, right, fits in very nicely with Rabbeinu Tam's earlier position, that the possibility to coerce tzedakah funds actually emerges from a communal kiblu alayhu, a communal taking upon themselves, that tzedakah is part of a public project, a public tax, if it were. So that's what we, I think, can really glean from the second answer of Rabbeinu Tam, and how it fits in with Tosafot's broader position with regard to these sugyot here, in these few dapim that discuss dinei tzedakah. Last thing we'll do is go a little bit into other variations on the theme of the third answer that we saw in Tosafot. So just as a reminder, the third answer was of Tosafot's two assumptions, to reject the second assumption, to reject the assumption that tzedakah is in fact an example of a mitzvah shematan schara b'tzida. And the Achronim actually, right, offer similar, those slightly different, I would say, variations on that theme, that also give us a different kind of window into how they see what tzedakah is, and how it operates. So the Ktsoda Choshen. So the Ktsoda Choshen refers to Tosafot's question and wants to offer his own solution, his own answer. So that's that, right, gives us again Tosafot's question. שכתב בצדקה אית בי שיבוד נכסה ליתן ממונו לצדקה. ואם כן, ממון עניים גביהו, כאילו חייב להם חוב ממש. אם כן, זה שאנו כופין אותו, היינו להחזיר לעניי עולם מה שחייב להם. So what's the Ktsoda Choshen saying here? If the tzedakah it be shibud nichse litain mamona tzedakah, right? So that the Ktsoda is pointing to the fact that there's shibud nechasim, right? That my property is essentially, right? Shibud nechasim is when my property is essentially liened, or that my property can even be collected from, right? That for debts that I owe, let's say, all of my property is considered mishubad to that debt. So even if I, sell land to someone and my creditor comes to, and they can even collect that land that I later sold, that's what it means for nechasim to be mishubadim. And that, right, the Ktsoda is picking up on the fact that nechasim are mishubadim tzedakah. So what does that mean? Essentially, what that means, according to the Ktsoda, is that tzedakah is not only a mitzvah, but it's considered a sort of chov. It's considered a kind of debt that I already owe to the aniyim. And that functionally, what's happening is not that I'm, voluntarily giving of my own goodwill or of my desire to fulfill mitzvah, my money to the poor, but that I am paying back a chov that I already owe, and that fundamentally, basically, before I give that money, I'm essentially holding on to the money that belongs to the aniyim. If that's the case, so it continues imkain. Right, the fact that we're coercively enforcing the payment of tzedakah, we're just forcing you to give money that you're actually chayav, that you actually owe to the aniyim. Right? Forget sure, it's a mitzvah shematan schar b'tzidah, but that doesn't take away the right or the obligation of the beit din even to make sure that money gets to its rightful owner. Right? So, right, it is only for those mitzvot where your nechasim are not already mishubadim, or I don't already owe the money to the other person. Okay, those kinds of mitzvot, if matan schar b'tzido, then beit din can't force someone to pay. But in a case where really there's already a debt in place, right, of course, beit din can coerce. So it's a similar variation on the theme of, sure, tzedakah, right, what Tosafot said was tzedakah includes a lav. What the Ksota is saying is not that tzedakah includes a lav, but that tzedakah includes shibud nechasim, and therefore doesn't fall under the general principle, the general category of mitzvah that beit din cannot coercively enforce. The Avnei Miluim offers a similar yet different answer. Right? For him, why is it that tzedakah doesn't fall under the category of mitzvah shematan schar b'tzidah? Lefi ma shekatav beikarim det leman yivarechecha lo kai al guf hanetina rak al ha de lo yera levavcha v'titcha lo shehu noten b'simcha ubetov levav v'lo kai al naton titein ayin sham. What does the Avnei Miluim say? He says that the matan schar b'tzidah, right, the leman yivarechecha, the schar that is promised is not schar that is promised for the actual, like, in exchange for the actual giving of charity, right? Giving charity is not a mitzvah aseh matan schar b'tzidah. What is leman yivarechecha about, or what is leman yivarechecha referring to? Leman yivarechecha is a reward not for the giving, but for the lo yera levavcha b'titcha lo, before the do not make your, basically you have to have the fact that you have to have a good attitude when giving tzedakah. The blessing that is promised is not a blessing that's promised for the giving of tzedakah itself, but for doing so betuv lev, right? Doing so with generosity and with kindness and with a good attitude. Right? If that's the case, then of course it makes sense that you can enforce tzedakah via coercion. Right? Right? If once you're enforcing it coercively, there's no generosity, there's no good attitude anyway, and so then there's no matan schar b'tzidah that's relevant in the first place. Right? The enforcement that's happening coercively is happening about the giving, not about the attitude. Right? And the giving itself, right, that doesn't have matan schar b'tzidah included. So just the three different ways that, right, the solution of the Tosafot in these two variations on answer number 3, which methodologically speaking, let's say, keeps assumption number 1, shekol mitzvah aseh matan schar b'tzidah, beit din cannot enforce via coercion, but rejects the assumption number 2 that tzedakah is an example of one such mitzvah. So why is tzedakah not an example of that mitzvah? So Tosafot's answer was that tzedakah includes a lav, both an aseh and a lav. Tzot's answer is that tzedakah isn't actually a mitzvah to give; it's a mitzvah to return a debt. And what the beit din is doing is only enforcing that money be returned to its rightful owner. And the Avnei Miluim argues that actually something of the opposite, that the reward being offered in is a reward not for the giving itself, but a reward for doing so with great generosity and graciousness and with a smile on your face. And that, of course, beit din not only isn't allowed to enforce, but really practically would have no way to enforce. So just to to review, to go back, what we did together today was we saw a Gemara on our daf chet about, right, different kinds of tzedakah and the ways that the local government can reassign it and can enforce the giving of tzedakah. We saw a kushya that Tosafot brought from the idea that tzedakah seems to be a mitzvah on Shalhevet Schwartz. We saw 4 different solutions, unpacked how they worked kind of technically and methodologically, and then took a deeper dive into both the Tosafot's second solution and saw how Tosafot and Rabbanit are building a picture of tzedakah as part of a larger apparatus of public works and of public welfare. And we took a deeper dive into the third and saw different variations of what are the different ways that we can see tzedakah differently from how we saw it before. See tzedakah either as returning a debt or as a mitzvah that's kind of intimately tied up with the attitude that comes along with it, and therefore to understand why it might not fit in under the general category of mitzvah on Shalhevet Schwartz. So thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you next week.